So, dear friends, you are all warmly welcome to this webinar on telling the truth about history, justice for victims of slavery and colonialism. And this webinar is held during the same week as the foreign ministers of the European Union are meeting in Stockholm. And we are also holding this in the same second last year of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which was started in 2015 and which adopted its program of activities in 2014 by the General Assembly by consensus. And that's a very important program because it declares that this is an auspicious time in history when everybody should join together with people of African descent to uphold their rights and understand the history and the background of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, which created the racism of today. And this international decade is based on the implementation of the program from the UN World Conference Against Racism, the so-called Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which contains really the global understanding and the consensus that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity and that it has to be recognized fully, and there also laid the basis for the coming calls for justice and reparations. The theme of the International Decade is recognition, justice, and development. So it's a matter also of ensuring the right to development for all, including people of African descent. And this webinar, we are taking a holistic approach to the matter of the transatlantic enslavement or slave trade, depending on which terminology we wish to use. There is a development here where there is a wish to describe it as the transatlantic trade in Africans or capture Africans rather than just the transatlantic slave trade. Anyhow, what we are trying to understand at this webinar is that it was not only the major slave trading countries which sent their ships to Africa and to the other side of the Atlantic that were involved, but that this was a project that included also many of the countries of Europe. Actually, most of the countries of Europe were intertwined and linked to the transatlantic slavery project through their economic benefiting and profiting from it and servicing the slave trade economy. And we wish to give this sort of understanding also here, which will be important. And we have three very good speakers here who have been working on these matters for a long time. Apart from myself, Lönn is my name, and I am here from the World Against Racism Network and the Committee in Remembrance of Swedish Transatlantic Slave Trade. And this webinar is organized by the World Against Racism Network, by the Friends of the Earth Sweden, and by the Committee in Remembrance of Swedish Transatlantic Slave Trade. So it's a meeting and a webinar where we have here three speakers who it is our friend from the United Kingdom with roots, of course, from both Africa and the Caribbean, Esther Stanford-Xosei. It is Barryl Biekman from the Netherlands, but also born in Suriname, who is the lead spokesperson for people of African descent. And we have Cannings-Sampson, who is leading the Guyana Assembly for the International Decade for People of African Descent. So she comes directly from the situation of the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade in the countries on the other side of the Atlantic. So we are very glad to have you all here, and we will have the interventions in this order. I will also say a few words in the end of this, and with this, and of course we will actually give time to discussion, to questions and answers after that we have heard the panelists here. So those who wish to ask questions or make comments will have that chance at the end of the presentations. And with this, I will be able to give the floor to Esther Stanford-Xosei. And Esther is the co-vice chair of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, who is also an internationally renowned and well-known activist on the matter of reparations and researcher on the issue of this transatlantic slave trade, slavery's effects both in Africa and for those who were transported. And she is we are very glad to have her here. And with this short introduction, I give the floor to Esther.
Thank you, Jan. And to also my fellow panelists. It's good to be here, and I have the difficult task of starting off. So I'm just going to sort of make some general comments in relation to our topic today, justice for the victims of slavery and colonialism. And when I was reflecting on what message I wanted to give, I think just really pondering on that question or that issue of who are the victims, because so much of the discourse that we're hearing at this time, and in particular in relation to issues of reparatory justice, victims and descendants of the original victims, that is survivors of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, and living today with the consequences of neocolonialism, their voices are being muted, silenced, and marginalized. And I come from a constituency that actually is trying to give greater visibility to the importance of recognizing the centrality of so-called victims. So no one wants to really see themselves as a victim, if we think about it, how we use that term in English. But victim, or recognition of who is a victim, is important in terms of being able to identify those whose rights need to be honored and respected in order to bring about justice. And so I'm just really beginning with those comments in terms of the subject matter that we're talking about today. So transatlantic slavery, different terms get used, and even in the promotional material for today's webinar, the term slave trade was used. And we have to have a correct understanding of what history we're talking about if we're really going to be able to repair and redress the harms of that history in our present. And so if we look at our story, as I would prefer to say, history, if we look at our people's story as African people, then our story is often written for us. Our history is being written for us, even in our present. And so terms like slave trade actually do not come from our experience, but they come from the narrative of those who colonized us and, if I dare say, conquered us. And so telling our stories is a big part of the repair and actually the rehabilitation of people who have been denied access to their histories, because of the dismemberment of their people, the tearing away of our people from our motherland, the trafficking of us into the diaspora, and the kind of, the ruptures that have occurred in our very fabric, in our societies, in our families, in our communities, and in our nations. And so thinking about that, it's really important to start off with a correct assessment of what's happening, and African-centered historians and scholars and who analyze our situation, such as, for instance, Professor Chinwezu, a Nigerian public intellectual, has always argued that there is a need for an Afrocentric, as he would call it, rectification of terms. And he actually has a really well-known paper called What Slave Trade? And he really contests this narrative that is popular and dominant, especially in UN kind of circles and so-called official kind of circles around slave trade, okay? Because really, if we think about what happened to our people, the buying and selling, this notion of trade, was actually a small part. Before that happened, there was invasions, there was conquest, people were warred upon. And so telling our narrative and starting off with a correct, actually reading of that history is really, really important for justice to those of us who are survivors of African enslaved people. And so in that regard, we're talking about a huge experience that some of us refer to in the Kiswahili tongue as the maangamizi. Some people might use the term maafa, which is also Kiswahili, but the term maangamizi is preferred because it really speaks to the intentionality to destroy us in terms of our original identities, okay? Not necessarily as a human reality, but in terms of our original identities. And so Professor Molena Karenga has argued that we should be talking about the maangamizi, which was not only a morally monstrous act of genocide, it was a morally monstrous destruction of life, morally monstrous destruction of human culture, morally monstrous destruction of human possibility. So that's really what we're talking about. So yes, even though we are alive today as survivors, this notion of being survivors of genocide, but also ethnocide is really important to recognize. Now, when I'm talking about genocide, obviously I'm using the framing of genocide that was coined by Dr. Raphael Lemkin, and we know there is the 1948 Genocide Convention, but Raphael Lemkin was really interested in studying how groups get destroyed. And he identified that you don't just destroy a group by killing members of the group directly, but if you destroy the essential foundations of life upon which that group rely on, then that is genocide. And there's a really great quote from him where he says, genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and the other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. And by that he means imposing the institutions, the legal systems, the education systems, the kind of cultural mores and so forth of a group or a people that have dominated another. And so it's in that context that the term genocide is being used. And then the term ethnocide as well is important to recognize, because ethnocide, in fact, was also coined by Raphael Lemkin, and he intended for the terms genocide and ethnocide to be used interchangeably. But ethnocide occurs where literally the people remain, but their original cultural patterns, their languages, their value systems, their kind of cosmologies can get destroyed. And so that is part of what we're talking about in terms of living with the consequences. We're talking about the period from around 1442 to 1888 in terms of the initial chattelization period. And that whole period cannot just be characterized by trade, because there was huge amounts of violence, okay, dispossessions, obviously chattel slavery, torture, conquest, plunder, and various crimes against humanities, various war crimes as well. And also there's a recognition that ecocide was part of that experience of chattel slavery. And that is really important to identify, because we are living in a time of worldwide climate and ecological crisis, and there is a connection between the structures of domination that were imposed by colonialism across the world, not just on African people, but indigenous people and other colonized peoples, and how that has impacted the way that we have inhabited and utilized a Mother Earth, that which sustains all of our lives. And so when we're thinking about what justice looks like, it's important to recognize the various injuries and harms that descendants or survivors of enslaved and colonized peoples live with. And I'm part of a structure called INCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which has identified that there are 5 injury areas that we should be thinking about in terms of repair. So there were injuries to our sense of peoplehood and nationhood, our identities, the people that we came from in Africa. Many of us as descendants of enslaved African people do not know. Of course, many people have done genealogical research and DNA testing, but that still doesn't give you 100% certainty in terms of tracing our lineages. There were injuries in terms of our sense of education, our value systems, our cultural systems, and how that got institutionalized. There's huge injuries in terms of the arenas of health, in the arenas of criminal justice, in the arenas, a big one, of wealth and poverty. And that also kind of correlates with the position of Human Rights Watch, who in 2001, in the lead up to the Third World Conference Against Racism in Durban, stated that when addressing relatively old wrongs, we do not base claims of reparations on the past abuse itself, that is chattel slavery, but on its contemporary effects. So the human rights position is really, we look at the contemporary effects of past abuses, and that includes structural harms, structural oppression and discrimination, not only on the grounds of race, but also every other kind of way of stratifying people, and in particular our socio-economic status. And reparations is very much necessary. It's something that is a right. People who have experienced harms, the harms of the nature that I've spoken about, are entitled to redress, and they have a right to reparation. And there is the basic principles and guidelines on a right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, which identifies that reparations must be holistic. And it begins with a cessation of whatever those violations are. So stopping the harm, okay? So can we imagine a world without racism, a world without anti-Blackness, a world without Afrophobia, or Afrophobia as some of you may refer to it? That's really what would be the first stage of repair, okay? But it must also entail restitution, measures not of compensation, which is what everyone normally jumps to. And then there's this notion of satisfaction, which is known as symbolic reparations. And finally, this notion of rehabilitation, which really speaks to questions of, people talk about healing, but it's actually looking at how do communities and peoples who have experienced historical and contemporary continuing oppression restore themselves, rebuild their agency, rebuild their capacity to actually be the change that we want to see. And so comprehensive reparations in terms of international law also require the removal of structures that have been built on centuries of illegal acts and aggression. And and here we're talking about transatlantic slavery, we're talking about colonialism and neo-colonialism. But reparations must also lead to the question of restitution. Restitution of what? So it's not just about us having a right to belong to our homelands that we've been dispossessed of, and in this case I'm talking about Africa. It's also about restitution of our sovereignty, okay, as African people. And that is the missing link that is not very much spoken about in a lot of the regional kind of frameworks on reparations. It just assumes that we're going to repair ourselves in a world that has been constructed, you know, as a result of empire and the dispossession of our people. And, you know, therefore, reparations must bring about actually fundamental structural transformation, and also changing the world in the same way that our dispossession, our ripping away from our motherland and being trafficked in the diaspora, and our loss of identity and our loss of our rights to our homeland changed the world. And the way that that then brought about a way of which not only were we being dispossessed, but also the indigenous people were being dispossessed at the same time. And the profits and the spoils of these wars that were waged on the various First Nations of the earth are what actually props up Europe today. So finally, I would just say that when thinking about victims, it's important that we hear the narratives and the perspectives and the experiences of those who are survivors. We are not just victims, but we are survivors. And we must be able to have a hearing. We must be able to not only gather the research, but actually tell our own stories, our own families' lineages. How much of us have been able to do that research to know how we as families, as communities in specific areas have been impacted, and how that impacted not just us, but how far can we go back in terms of our lineage. And that must be accommodated in any reparations process. And finally, I'd like to say that when we're thinking about who are the victims are not just us. It started with our ancestors. And even though we may not know all of their names, we may not even know all of their identities, there are ways, and it is becoming easier to identify them. And so when we think about, especially those of us who also, you know, were trafficked to the Caribbean, and there's a lot of initiatives going on right now, but what they are doing is they are excluding the voices of our African ancestors, because any regional program in itself will deny the African personhood and international legal personality of our African ancestors that were trafficked. You know, they were not just Guyanese people and Bajans and St. Vincents. They were African ethnicities and nationalities. They were Yorubas, they were Igbos, they were Akans, they were Fantes. And we need to make those connections. We need to repair that rupture and that breach that has happened in our families and our communities so that we can be whole again. And it is when we are whole and we have reconnected that we will then have the power as a global people, over 1.4 billion strong, as a global nation, to be able to hold our oppressors and those who continue to benefit from the unjust enrichment as a result of chattel slavery and colonialism. We will be able to hold them to account. But we can only do so when in the process we are also transforming the very structures of domination so that we have a world that is not premised on racial capitalism and dispossessing others. Okay, we have to see our struggle as a civilizational reparation struggle. And it's really also a struggle to effect planet repairs. And by that, I mean that it wasn't just us as people, and in particular African people, that were harmed. The interaction of us with other members of the human family and the way in which the plantation system operated and the Industrial Revolution and racial capitalism has meant that harm has also been done to our Mother Earth, our environment, the pollution, the ecocide that is impacting our ability to live and actually have the right to life. It's impacting our rights to a healthy environment. It's impacting our food systems. It's impacting just even basic drinking water. And that obviously has impacts on our personal health, but also what's known as planetary health. So we're in a very unique time to be able to set a new standard of global justice, where we ensure that our repair struggle is not premised on propping up and reinforcing a system that is only going to continue to harm others. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Esther, for this very important and excellent introduction from your side. With regard to names used, as you may have heard, I used both your terminology and the old terminology when I introduced this webinar, and it's a matter of we are in a transition phase regarding the names, I think so, because people cannot change the name of organizations and so on overnight. So it's a transition, but it's very important to explain this, because it helps to truly understand what we are talking about, that the so-called slave trade was not a trade of any sort. It was a brutal war that took place for 400 years or even more against the African continent. So with this, I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Barryl Biekman, who is, among many other things, she is the chair of the Dutch platform Slavery Past, and she has been a leading personality around the globe in activism regarding the rights of people of African descent, and very much recognized as such. But she has a particular role that she played in the Netherlands, namely to raise the awareness, to constantly fight against any misrepresentation of the Dutch role in the transatlantic slave trade, and also the campaign for recognition, for the establishment of a big monument in Amsterdam, for the for institutions, and now the result that the Netherlands has more or less apologized for its role in the transatlantic trade of Africans and slavery in the Caribbean, but without progressing on the issue of reparations. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Barryl Biekman. You are much welcome.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, family on the screen. And thank you, Sister Esther, for clearing some of the terms. And I must confess, to speak after you is a little bit difficult. Because this teaching, in fact, to unlearn, learn to unlearn, not speaking about, for instance, Holocaust, but speak about Manga Amesi. Mava is also correct, but you spoke about Afrophobia. We use the term Afrophobia. So thank you, Sister Esther. It is no problem that everybody must know that Esther is our mentor, our coach when it concerns reparatory justice issues. a lot of time she was in the Netherlands to teach us, to educate us. So thank you, Sister Esther, for your everlasting dedication. They call you the identification of the reparation movement. So, and Sister Esther, when you start, you underpin what Jan Lönn, the instructions that you get from Jan Lönn, and me also, I get some instruction because I explained to Jan what I intend to talk about, and he said, no, you have to do this and not that. So thank you, Jan, because you give me then the power to speak about the process. He asked me to speak about process, traject, taking from a situation from the Netherlands. And directly, I would like to bring in memory that during the recently Baltimore Summit of the State of the Black World, the chairman of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, Professor Hilary Beckles, during his remarks shared some interesting observations with the participants. He mentioned the increasing of the global interest in the issue of reparatory justice, the increasing of more and more organizations, institutions, governments, and families who rush to apologize for their part in the crimes against the African humanity and the African people. The increasing interest in joining the reparation movement. And that observation is really true, because we also notice this in the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, France, Luxembourg, UK was always in the lead, always in the lead. Thanks to the people like Sister Esther, what I identify her as the identification of the reparation movement. In the 3 times that I have visited Sweden, many people, including young people with Pan-African minds and awareness about the active role of Sweden in the crimes against humanity, for instance, in the maritime industries, the building of the ships. A lot of people don't know about that, so I hope that Jan will explain more about that. In France, I have met many Pan-Africans and activists from the MARE, the reparation movement, who have their strong wings and connections in the French Caribbean. In Germany, where I have been a couple of times, Sister Esther was also with us there. I have mainly met the activists who have been involved in actions regarding the claim for reparations for the Herero genocide. If we were to delve into Germany, we would be amazed at what Africans endured during the Second World War, and I'm referring to the experiments. And then I come to the Netherlands in 1998. If one had the guts in the Netherlands to make suggestions in this direction of apology or reparations, you already knew what to expect. You knew in advance that you would be singled out, warned out for radical, and didn't have to count on sympathy within your own community. And that is exactly what happened to the national platform of the Dutch slavery past 2 decades ago, during the founding and development of the organization, of the development of the conversation of the mission. The mission, not only in the context of the realization of a national monument and the institute, but also the claiming for reparations. And it is not necessary to go in that what we understand by reparations. Sister Esther has bring us in the essence of this term. And that is exactly the reasons that we started in the Netherlands with master classes on reparatory justice, and Sister Esther, amongst many other master teachers who were invited and came to the Netherlands to assist with master classes on reparatory justice, including the sharing of knowledge in the context of conceptual framework. That there is an increasing interest in the history of the the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and colonialism. Why I say so is that the term mangamisi is not yet landed in the minds of the people. That is something that we have to work on that. It is also noticeable here in the Netherlands, within the Kingdom and Republic of Suriname. Many conferences, congresses, symposia, and seminars are devoted to this reparatory justice subject. But moreover, about the apology and the effect of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. People are not in the Netherlands talk about reparatory justice as such. And as we see in several countries, institutions, they are rushing to express regret, apology, or other forms for their part in the crime against humanity committed by related entities for centuries. There is no doubt that the increasing interest in recognition this reprehensible past, whether or not on the basis of research carried out as a crime against humanity, is partly the result of the various United Nations international conventions and resolutions, including 2001, the Durban Conference, 2009, the Durban Review, and then we have 2021 when we commemorate 20 years of the DDPA, and the resolutions of the European Parliament 2019, 2020, and of course the extensive activities of the reparation movement in Africa, amongst others. The resolutions urge countries that have committed human rights violations to apologize and to take appropriate measures in the area of reparatory justice is if this had not already taken place. Think, for instance, at the Accra the Accra resolution on the reparatory justice in last year. Also consider the increasingly complex situation to steer the actions and activities in the right and effective direction. The international pressure from the global Pan-African reparation movement, the Caribbean countries represented in CARICOM, the global civil communities, descendants of enslaved Africans and human rights activists have all contributed significantly to raising awareness over the past decade. And amongst these organizations is the PARCU from Sister Esther. And the value of PARCU is that they are focusing on the masses, the mass movement. And that is also something that we are now busy in the Netherlands to organize the masses, and not only the people of the African descent, but what I learned also is that we have to bring also other nations, other ethnicity to the table so that they understand what it is all about. And the International UN Decade for People of Africa is partly also the result of the actions of the global reparations movement. African diaspora scientists, jurists, and human rights activists in order to promote political will to implement the DDPA and the International UN Decade in National Action Plan. And still this has not happened. And Sister Esther is right. You cannot apology and talk about reparations if the systems that underpressed us, that marginalized us are still the same. And that's why I would like from this side congratulate and compliment Jan Lönn, because sometimes I'm thinking that Jan Lönn is playing blacker than African than me, because he always reminds me, when we are in the United Nations, he reminds me of the mission of the Durban Declaration and program of the mission of the decade, the international decade. So I'm coming to an end. Following, in fact, I would like to explain more about the intensive process that we undergo in the Netherlands to get to the point to date that the state of the Netherlands finally apologized. I would also share with you the many local governments and financial institutions amongst the Dutch Central Bank that apologies for their part in the enslavement of African people and the crime against Africa as a whole. But what is an apology without reparatory justice? But if you analyze the apology of the Dutch of the Dutch state, you will notice that they apologize to the people, but they left Africa out, and so there is a lot of work to do. So Jan, how many minutes I have? Because I need 2 minutes more.
Yes, you have 2 minutes more. Very welcome. Please talk about reparations and talk about.
Yes, please. I'm happy, and because you know what happened in the United Nations, they closed it.
No, I am not like that.
Okay, thank you, Jan. So the LPS maintains that apologizing is not an isolated issue, but an important part of reparatory justice. In this context, our organization follows the basic principles and guidelines on the right to redress and compensation for victims of gross violation of international human rights law and serious violation of international humanitarian law. Examination of the facts, official facts from African-centered perspective. Sister Esther, that is very true, that we, from an African-centered perspective, because all the research, all the studies that has done until now in the Netherlands has come from white historians or white professors. So it's very true. It's very true. And examination of the facts, official confirmation of the facts, apologies, and an opportunity for victims to speak at a public forum about their experience and the opportunity to be actively involved in the so-called reparation process. These are essential part of the redress and compensation process according to international law. The involvement of the descendants of the enslaved. For example, in the investigation, we can also use oral history. I can say our story, yes, and the tradition, because what they are doing now is ask the organizations, ask people, send information on how you see the effects of the transatlantic slavery. So the effects, you have to write it on paper instead of they bring us in a whole hall, you know, a whole day or 2 days that we can speak, that we can hear the voices of the victims. So I'm coming now to an end, 1 minute. Recently, on December 19, 2022, the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, on behalf of the Dutch state, apologized. I quote, "For the actions of the Dutch state in the past, and when you go to the issue of racism, you will see that it is the past is not the past. The past is still now." And that's why he also referred the apology to their daughters and sons and to all their descendants to here and now. So I don't know, we have to, in the international arena, we have to analyze more what he has said. "I apologize for the role and commitment of our historic administrative predecessors in allowing, enabling, promoting, perpetrating, and profiting from the slave trade and slavery that have long and structurally undermined human dignity. Furthermore, I apologize for the fact that successive government after the abolition in 1863 of the slavery, too little has been done to acknowledge that the history of slavery had and still has a negative impact, and end of quote. Directly after, the Prime Minister was clear to the press, this is it and no question of reparations. We are allocating 200 million to finance a number of projects. Reparations is not an issue. And here, Sister Esther and family, Jan, here is the evidence that we in the Netherlands cannot solve this problem alone. We need the global mass movement to assist, to support, to help. Okay? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Barryl, for this introduction, and we will be able to follow up in the questions also. Now we have the pleasure to invite our friend from Guyana, Olive Cannings-Sampson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Guyana Assembly for the International Decade for People of African Descent, which is set up to promote the decade in Guyana. And she has a background in international work and also in the grassroots work on children and women in Guyana. And we are very happy to have her here because we are trying to talk about the entire transatlantic slave trade or slavery complex, which engaged most of the European countries in one way or another, even countries which had no transatlantic no Atlantic harbors. They were still engaged in Switzerland. There were a lot of ownership of plantations, for example. From Germany, they were heavily involved in not only the shipping, but in economies. And Sweden, from where I am now, Sweden had a very strong role in profiting from the sales to the shipping industry, etc. We are going to talk a little bit about that later, because now I just am mentioning that in Guyana there were several Swedish plantation owners who owned large plantations, and when one of them died, then a large amount of resources, of financial resources, were transferred to Sweden. And in Sweden, it was taken over to some extent by the government administration and used for various purposes, setting up foundations, etc., for various purposes. It was even used to borrow to supply the state budget for a few years, etc., etc. So it's an example of how even a country like Sweden has this sort of linkages to a country like Guyana and the plantations there, which had around 1,000 of enslaved at that time. So against this background, we are very keen to have a little bit background on what is the situation of those who were enslaved in Guyana today. So please, Olivia. Hello. Can you?
There you go. I'm sorry. I was muted
Yes.
and chopping away. But
Yes.
Jan, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate and to say that it's really difficult to follow the presentations that came before. One wants to stop and really digest them and to really explore more what the two presenters said, because there's so much to say and to learn from them. You know, one of the things that that struck me, and has of course struck me more with every day that passes, is the fact that it is so hard to disentangle enslavement of our ancestors and all that has followed from the system in which we currently live. This system is so mired in the legacy of the enslavement and how it benefited and brought riches to some people. We have to work hard to inform our own people about what that means, something more than just your ancestors were enslaved, but what it means and what it meant then. So I didn't mean to digress, but there's so much, and I look forward to the question and answer and discussion that follows. But again, I really appreciate your invitation to join this panel and to tell the truth about history. My talk really focuses exclusively on Guyana, as you said, and what we are experiencing. I'd like to discuss the persistent problem of poverty in the African Guyanese community. I should note that today the poverty rate stands at somewhere between 48 and 50% in Guyana, with the majority of the affected being African Guyanese or people of mixed race, meaning African and one other race. So the poverty experienced by African descendants in Guyana today has its roots in slavery and colonization. So I'd like to look a bit at the long reach of history as it affects our community even today, and why an apology and reparations are essential to address the wrongs of the past, but also so that we can all examine the regulations, practices, and laws that continue to deliver unequal and unjust outcomes that affect African communities. At emancipation, approximately 88,000 Africans were freed in then British Guyana. After emancipation, roughly 13,000 Africans were brought to the colony as indentured laborers. So we can safely say that the majority of the African descendants in Guyana today are direct descendants of formerly enslaved Africans. Further, most African Guyanese still live in or maintain ties to the villages, once plantations, on which their forefathers were enslaved. And of course, all of us still carry the surnames of those who owned our forefathers. In many ways, we continue to be branded like cattle. That's a bit of history. The peculiar emancipation legislation passed by the British Parliament on the 20th of August, 1833, and which took effect on August the 1st, 1834, put into practice a transitional phase, which included reassigning the roles of the enslaved as apprentices until 1838. So although the legislation was passed in 1834, emancipation did not occur until 1838. We went from being enslaved and pretty proficient at what we were doing to being apprentices. I can't explain that logic, but that's what happened. During this phase of apprenticeship, enslaved Africans were able to work what we would call today a side job, in addition to their continued free labor for their plantation owners. So in British Guyana, the apprenticed Africans often formed work gangs or groups and went from plantation to plantation in their time, in their whatever little time they had, to work for pay. This period of apprenticeship is important in African Guyanese history, as the income earned served to fund the largest cooperative financial investment in Guyana's history, the village movement. After emancipation, pooling their savings, Africans bought the plantations abandoned by European planters. The first purchase was in November of 1839, Plantation Northbrook, It was purchased by 83 men and women who pooled all their savings to purchase this plantation. Many others followed their examples, and Africans purchased entire plantations communally or portions of land individually, and ultimately all established, they established villages. We refer to this period as the village movement. Africans established the rules and regulations of these communities, these villages, and they became the first formal rural municipalities of the colony, and actually the foundation of what is Guyana's local government system today. But what happened at emancipation after this bold start is at the root of the enduring poverty of the African Guyanese community. At emancipation, the British government sought around 20 million to pay for the loss of their enslaved laborers, slave plantation owners. Many of those in receipt of this compensation were from the higher echelons of British society. While they were compensated, Africans were not compensated for over 200 years of forced labor. Once Africans established, so that's the first thing that happened after emancipation that we see contributing to the persistent poverty. Once Africans established themselves in their villages and as producers, service providers, for example, dray cart drivers, welders, and other employment or business, right, the colonial government imposed regressive taxes that unfairly burdened them. They had to have licenses to do almost everything that they did. In addition, a system of licensed commissioners or middlemen, non-Black, non-African, through whom they were forced to sell their produce at prices, right, at prices set by the middlemen. So that system was imposed so that producers, because these Africans were farmers, many of them, they could not sell directly in the marketplace. They had to sell to a middleman, and that middleman set the price. And those middlemen tended to be Portuguese, indentured, once indentured, and then established as business persons. In addition, sadly, the very canals and polders and the very intricate irrigation and flood control system that the enslaved had dug miles and miles and miles of canals that still are in use in Guyana today to control floods, because much like the Netherlands, our coastline is underwater. And that entire coastline was saved from the sea by the work of Africans. The British colonial government utilized that system often to deliberately flood the villages and farms of Africans, ultimately, eventually forcing people off of their farms into the city to find work. And so the farms and the villages that they so carefully purchased and tried to form were damaged in many ways by this tax system and the flooding of the farms. They struggled to survive in a system deliberately hostile to them, regulations that deliberately sought to oppress and create obstacles to their progress. And I'd like to share a specific example of what happened to those villages. Excuse me. This is an example of the railway that was built from Georgetown, the capital city, all along the Atlantic coast to the village of Rossignol, at about 35 to 40 miles. So the people of the first village, as I told you, that plantation Northbrook, they renamed it Victoria. The people of Victoria had settled on their land and built homes. They were doing very well. They had productive farms and livestock. After centuries of enslavement, they were finally legally permitted to earn money between 1834 and 1838, and they had saved their earnings, as I had previously said. The government never informed them that they intended to put down a railway that would traverse their village. But they had heard about the train line that was going to be built, even as they continued to work their village, work their land. The land that the train would cross in Victoria is fully occupied by houses, farms, and livestock. Right? And if the train came through, it would destroy their homes, their livelihood, and of course, their dreams. As I said earlier, they had already established a village structure. And so the village committee heard about this project. They were never formally informed, heard about the project, and sent a letter to the governor requesting an opportunity to discuss it and to negotiate the path that the train might pass to avoid any destruction to their community. Although they wrote the governor, they waited and waited for a response, and the governor never responded. So one day, as they were in their fields and doing their work around the village, 300 railway men arrived, destroyed homes, destroyed farms, anything that was in the path of the railway, and put down that railway line. Through many, many homes, many farms. It was just destructive. No villager was ever compensated for the loss of land. These people had already used all of their savings to purchase that land, and they had been just eking out an existence but doing well. They were building their community. They didn't have money in the bank waiting for the destruction of their village so that they could rebuild. They lost literally everything. So much so, they were so much despair that 3 people committed suicide. And the governor's comment to that was that he could not even understand how they could have survived enslavement only to kill themselves because a train had come through their community. That was his only comment. There was no reparations, no compensation in any way. So that railway continued all the way across the East Coast and ran through many African villages on its way. That is just the story of one village, right? And so that story is an example of the challenges that people of African descent in Guyana, the descendants of the enslaved, have continued to confronted it then. And so many of the systems put in place at that time, the repressive tax system and other barriers to African progress, continued through independence and still exist in many areas today. So where are we today? As of 2021, the Guyanese Bureau of Statistics reported the proportion of workers in informal employment was approximately 50%, which, that's the level of really formal unemployment. The International Monetary Fund and Caribbean regional economists estimated that the informal economy represented 35 to 44% of total economic activities. In Region 10, Guyana has 10 administrative regions. Region 10 has a large African Guyanese population, and the unemployment rate there is 60%. In this and most informal rural most rural communities, workers are engaged in cash crop or small-scale agriculture or fishing. Others work in artisanal mining, hospitality, or service sectors, including transportation, such as taxi drivers. In urban areas, that's riverboat taxis. In urban areas, informal work is clustered in domestic, retail, and service sectors. Regional economists noted that high unemployment motivated many people to create their own work, such as driving a private minibus, selling ice cream from a bicycle-mounted cooler, or setting up food carts in the street. Unorganized workers, particularly women in the informal sector, are often paid less than the minimum wage. Informal sector workers and part-time workers are covered by wage, hours, and other regulations, but they are not enforced. It should be noted that although primary and secondary education is free, the high school dropout rate is estimated to be about 50%, with the majority being African Guyanese children. This is because many parents cannot afford to keep their children in school. They cannot provide transportation to school, nor provide lunch for the children to take to school. As a result of grinding poverty, child labor is also very prevalent. Children perform dangerous tasks in mining. In addition, Guyana's laws allow children ages from 16 to 17 to conduct night work in industrial activity. And they participate because poverty is driving families to expose their children in this way. In some, African Guyanese have toiled from 1621, when the Dutch brought them in chains to the shores of today's Guyana, and have contributed to the fabulous wealth of others. Our contributions to that wealth is largely unrecognized still, even though there's such a huge reparations movement. And we have not begun, I think, to really plumb the depths of how much Africans, both on the continent and those in the diaspora, have contributed to the enormous wealth gap between our nations and those of our former colonial masters, and as Jan pointed out, others who may not have held colonies in the Caribbean or on the continent, but whose economies were completely connected to the enslavement of persons of African descent, and whose economies thrived as a result of it. Our progress through our own legacy, our own agency, has always been stymied by those with power. The grinding poverty in which the majority of African Guyanese live is directly related to the enslavement of our ancestors. Going to any of the villages that were former plantations and seeing how people live, the fact that they are struggling to hold on to the land that their forefathers bought because of the onerous tax system, the difficulty in acknowledging ancestral land and in passing it on to the generations, has been one way in which Africans have not been able to take advantage of that huge step that their forefathers made in the purchase of abandoned plantations. The difficulty that they face in going to a bank and being able to leverage land that is owned by Africans, leveraging it for capital to invest in a business or anything, that is extremely difficult for people of African descent because the banking system is still skewed to benefit others. And what they are required to bring to the table is often onerous, impossible for them, for us to do. So the denial of any compensation or any effort to create a formal path of rehabilitation for our communities or reparations to redress the total destruction of our lives is what sees us in this condition of continued poverty. And the one thing I must say is our determination is there. You know, our community is determined to continue this fight for recognition of our contributions to the current state of Guyana, but also to the wealth of those who enslaved our forefathers and whose colonies we resided in as citizens, but citizens who were denied equal rights and equal opportunities. I look forward to expanding on these few comments as we proceed. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you really so much. It's such an important contribution because it gives really the full perspective of what happened to the enslaved persons and people on the plantations when they were so-called emancipated to work as apprentices for some more years and then put into poverty. And this is not the case only for Guyana, but the situation is overall in the countries where the slavery was practiced in this industrialized manner. And of course, Africans were not captured because of race. they were captured because of profit, and race and racism was used and developed in order to make this possible. And this crime against humanity was systematically pursued and practiced by the Europe of Enlightenment, where ideas of greater freedoms and rights for its own peoples were developed. And despite that, those states at every level were aware of all the atrocities, of the genocidal character of this the trade in Africans, or slave trade. They continued. The enslavement of Africans was carried out for economic gains. And there was a tremendous enrichment, and the entire global system was reconstructed around this, including, of course, the colonial practices in Asia and other parts of the world. We cannot ignore this, and we have to put it into the very important tasks that we have now, also on securing a global development where the right to development is ensured for all the peoples. And it's a great challenge, a great task. And we must also make sure that everyone will accept what they have been had their governments to decide in the UN, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the Program of Activities of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which is really downgraded and which is not taken seriously. So with this, I would like to invite those who have not put their name and address or contact details in the chat box to do it if they so want, and be receiving information or anything for us to stay in contact. And I will now open the floor for possible comments or questions, short comments, I would say. And I will also say that we have put an end for this webinar at 8:30 our time here, but we can continue a little bit if our panelists are available. So with this, I will now give the floor to our friend, which HGSEN. Could you kindly, we ask you to unmute yourself.
Yes, good afternoon here. Good
Yes.
night, good evening. Yeah, my name is Humphrey Senior. I am from Curacao, and I have a comment on the intervention of Barryl Biekman. If we accept the Dutch apologize now, it will set a trend for the countries to follow suit. Because by not recognizing that slavery and slave trade were crimes against humanity, and it is in this context of not recognizing that the Dutch government said that there will be no reparations. What happened, in fact, is that the Dutch government took a walk with the global movement of reparations. And I think that we have to study this matter closely. I agree with Barryl, since they are not according with the UN guidelines and the whole way of reparatory justice, especially not recognizing that what happened, that this during the slavery, that it was a crime against humanity, not now, but also then. So that is my comment on what Barryl Biekman brought forward.
So I can only say yes, I agree, and that's why I have called for a more global mission that because what the Dutch government has done, they have apologized, but they were not doing this harms in a vacuum. They were together with the European nation states, the Western nation states. So I'm looking to Sister Esther if she is agree that since the Dutch state has apologized, they has also apologized for the UK, for France, for Spain, for all who committed these crimes. So we have to put hands together to make sure that the Dutch government cannot walk away with only an apology. And that is why we are working now in the Netherlands. We have now a National Reparation Commission where we have a structure whereby we have decided about 5 commissions, and one of the commission is about the legal actions towards the Dutch government, but we are also aware of the fact that the national laws are not enough. So that is something that we are studying now, and this week we start an app group with all the other 6 can I say countries within. We have 3 local government of what we say openbare lichamen, the best, and we have Aruba, Sint Maarten, and Curaçao. So this week we start an app group to take it more within the kingdom. We have Suriname, we have also Guyana, because Guyana was also, I think, about 200 years under Dutch.
200 years. The Dutch held slaves in Guyana.
So
held our people
yes.
for longer than any other of the Europeans from 1621 until the British took that colony in 1804.
Yes. And therefore, it is necessary that we put hands together according to a coordinated, structured cohesion strategy, and with other in Europe and in the global sphere. So I want to pass this I'm agree. So Mr.
Humphrey.
I'm agree. So I'm looking at Sister Esther because she can take it from an international perspective.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
All right. I don't see any more hands here. Am I right that there are no more hands?
There's some hands. Knee and is it sure?
1, 2. Oh, 3 participants raised their hands. I see. Okay. We take Ni Muhammad.
Well, the name is Neokwe Hammond. Good evening.
Well,
thank you very much.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much for allowing me to take it up. It's just something that I want us to think about, because what is happening now in North Africa is that there is a brutalization of African people trying to enter Europe, and they are being brutalized with the support of the European Union. And if we talk about reparatory justice, and we talk about slavery and the deep, deep consequences of slavery, the route it had taken and the things that are happening now, and I think that it's important that organizations like ours, which is talking about reparatory justice, should point fingers at those they have to point fingers at and engage them to stop the brutalization of Africans who are trying to cross the Mediterranean, dying in the process, being thrown into jail or in Europe. And Europe has become very nervous because of this. I'm just putting this on board so that we can all think about it. And when you hear it, you can look at it with another eye. And since we're talking about reparatory justice, we can also start thinking about how can we ensure that the governments back home on the African continent can break free of those ties they have with European economic forces, which is making the people want to get out of it. Thank you very much. This is what I want to drop here.
Thank you so much. Now we have Tor Björk.
Thank you. My name is Tor Björk from Friends of the Earth, Sweden. One of the initiators of this Action Week and this discussion today. I feel very much privileged to be part of this dialogue, and what Hammond says and what all others says is precisely what our intention was with this dialogue. We need to include the whole picture of ethnic, economic, ecological, gender, all these kind of oppressions, and fight for utopia and something that we will receive one day, which is an anti-racist world order. And precisely as Hammond says, we have been really addressing during this week the need for challenging the whole trade system. As the trade system is today, via Campesina, Friends of the Earth discussed this on Tuesday. It is constructed in such a way that it destroys the agriculture in the global south. Dumping agro-industrial products, making it impossible to survive on the African and other countrysides. We also see that the patent and other ways of organizing the trade and financial system is making it impossible to industrialize. It's sort of prohibiting. You're not allowed to developing your industry. You're not allowed to do exactly what Sweden, Netherlands, and other countries were doing. They were protecting their own industries for a time period until they were strong enough. And I still believe that the kind of demands for reparation has a place in this need of challenge the whole system. And I congratulate that we came together. And I'm also sitting in the International Council of World Social Forum and an assembly who's now established for linking all the movements. Because I think that this is the future. We have to understand that we need global cooperation. And I do invite everyone to come be part of that process and the next World Social Forum, which will take place in Nepal in next year. I'm also sitting in the International Council of the International Peace Bureau, very, very old, the broadest peace organization. So let's unite while maintaining our specific interests. So thank you very much, Hammond and everybody else, and I look forward to continued cooperation. Thank you very much.
Jan, you're
You have
muted.
to unmute. Jan, you have to unmute.
Thank you so much, Tord. And that's exactly what it is about, that we need to reach out very broadly with the messages that we have from today. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Aishira Sisila and ask her to unmute herself.
Good afternoon, all. I really appreciate the contributions of all the speakers. I wanted to offer this perspective from someone from St. Martin, one of the, I really rather we call it what it is, the colonies of the Netherlands still, these non-independent territories, and the difficulty we have, especially the governments, in responding in a way that is not filtered through the lens of the Dutch state. Often, and especially if you look at the pandemic and after we suffered a Category 5+ Hurricane Irma in 2017, the conditions that were put on the islands, oftentimes in order to be able to receive assistance, the islands are forced to speak in a certain way. So in terms of the apology, you see some of the islands, although they disagree in the way that things happen, you see the government officials acting and lining up with the Dutch state completely against the interests of the people. And I also want to offer this perspective of I heard about a structure, a kingdom structure, even with the report that came out, which the Dutch state ignored, which advised for these crimes to be put in a law, the crimes against humanity to be put in a law, and also that that reparatory justice be offered, which the Dutch state ignored. The islands, the people, we here were not properly consulted and were not part of this process in a way that would mean that our contribution was effective. They hardly had any meetings here on a ground level. So I'm also, I heard about the kingdom structure that Dr. Biekman mentioned, really through via, but who are these people that are representing our islands, and how are the voices of the people heard and respected? So we really must remember that we really have colonies out here that, you know, and we really need that global push to include and also to put a pressure on the Dutch state, as they are being the example for other European countries. I do agree with that. I think that it's good for all of us to be cognizant of that. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate everyone's contribution.
Okay, so now is there anybody else who wish to take the floor? And if not...
Wait a minute, Jan, wait a minute.
Oh, there is somebody.
There's someone, yes. So
yes.
Why I direct the issue of the going to court is to Sister Esther, because she's an expert. She is a lawyer, so she can give the answer, I think, the right answer. Because we have already noticed that, for instance, in the Netherlands, these lawyers, they are using the national law, and I don't think that they have experience also in this whole area of reparatory justice regarding the transatlantic slavery, slave trade, and colonialism, and we can also mention more harms. But anyway, to Ashira, I would like to mention the fact that in St. Martin we have an organization that carry the associated membership of CARICOM. We have the same in Bonaire, and I thought that that it is wise to build a joint organization with those two. And what I have done also, I approach Curaçao. I know Jean Hendrikus is there. She is running she's the leader of the National Reparation Commission. I spoke with Van Putten, Clyde Van Putten. He is from Ustaz. And what has left is Saba and Aruba. And what I know is that in Aruba, they are busy with to form a National Reparation Commission. I see Cyrelda Jackson, she is there. I saw also another lady who is very active also, but they have to find out, they have to decide who are the best to represent them. So I leave it to them, and because it's very complicated in these countries. And Saba is I didn't reach someone from Saba, because I don't know if they are also active in this area. So I hope that you have the trust that that we capture the right people who are in can represent the mass movement in your country. So, Sister Ashira, I hope that you are confident with my answer.
Okay, so dear friends, thank you so much all for participating in this. I am really happy that we have had so many participants.
Sister Esther, you forget Sister
Oh, Esther, want to say something? You have to unmute.
Yes, very quickly, very quickly.
Yes. Yes.
So regarding, look, in terms of national legal strategies in Europe, they're going to be very limited, okay? I don't know, because we've got this injury to our sense of peoplehood and nationhood. Just think about it. If we look at the case of Jewish people in terms of the Jewish Holocaust, they didn't wage their struggle as separate communities of Jewish people, one in one country, set in this country, another in. They recognized that they are one people who were in diaspora, okay? And the problem that we have as a people is that this injury to our peoplehood and nationhood is actually limiting and restricting our worldview and therefore our fighting strategies and potential. I mean, it's been well recognized, even in terms of one of the earliest legal opinions that was done by Lord Gifford in 1993, that there was a need for a special tribunal, just like Jewish people didn't go to Nazi courts in terms of adjudicating the question of the Jewish Holocaust. There was a need to set up new law, and that's why there were the Nuremberg tribunals. Why we think we're going to get justice within a system that was created to legitimize conquest and our dispossession and make it, legalize it, under the guise of international law and international relations, is part of the mental enslavement, that we need to decolonize our minds so that we can have a sovereign imagination, so that we can actually know how to wage our struggle. And so in that sense, we have to create new legal mechanisms. It's as simple as that. Because these court cases, which have been going now, from the early 90s, there's not been much success, and there's been dozens of them around the world, if not hundreds, okay? So we have to recognize that this is the most long-standing, greatest crime against humanity that has impacted millions of our people over centuries, okay? And we have to build the global mechanisms, which we're not going to do alone, okay, the global mechanisms around accountability. Now, that's why in the work that I'm doing, we are very much in favor of establishing what's called people's tribunals, because people's tribunals are a way of actually trying to bring about justice for communities and peoples that are historically excluded. And let's not forget that so-called international law was used to legalize conquest, okay, and so-called enslavement, because that's why one of the standard rebuttals or defenses that European governments, including the government in the UK, where I operate, is to say, well, slavery was legal. And we have to judge what happened by the laws at the time. But even at the time, it was illegal. African people, we had our own law, and they were violated. We were part of shaping international law. So it is a huge battle. But there are times when actions are taken strategically to actually try and move a campaign or a struggle forward. And legal actions can have an educational value to also expose the inadequacy of the existing International Criminal Court, where, for instance, they're very fond of trying African heads of state, but yet we don't have the war criminals who are waging war from Europe and North America, Bush, Blair, and the others, Obama and others. They'll never appear before the International Criminal Court. That's what we're talking about in terms of the legacy of the Maangamizi. It means some people and nations are literally beyond reproach. And we have to create an alternative world, but it's not going to come about because of elites. It's only going to come about through the joining of movements and building strong enough people's power across the world, unifying with other people who are taking similar causes. For instance, there was an action recently with 12 Commonwealth nations really calling for redress around reparations as a result of being colonized by the British Empire. And this was in response to the coronation of King Charles III. And finally, I just wanted to say to Sister Ashira, I think it was, it's important that I heard the response that Sister Barryl gave, but I would say that as people, we have to represent ourselves. You see, the issue that I have and that goes against international law, CARICOM states, like African Union states, have to uphold international law and the rights of victims. And that means somebody doesn't create a table on a platform and then say to you, come and join it. When there's already a plan, you haven't been involved in shaping it. But unless our people organize themselves and also make demands of those states, make demands of those so-called commissions, okay, then your voices will not be heard. It's not something someone's going to do for you. You have to build that alternative. And yes, you can work with them if people are inclined to work with you, but create your own bodies of representation. There is, even within the realm of the United Nations operations, notions of unrepresented peoples and nations. And we are in a unique position in that many of us in diasporas, particularly in the Caribbean and the Dutch colonized Caribbean still, are unrepresented people and nations. But unless you yourself equip yourself with knowledge about your rights and about what the arguments are that can actually bolster your case, you will just be subjugated all over again, because people will tell you, well, we've created a seat at a table for you. But yet, as I said, you have had no say in actually designing what that table and what that landscape and what that vision of repair looks like. And this is about you, your family, your lineage, your community, your people, and the states that currently exist. Our people were not citizens of these states in the Caribbean. They were not. They were citizens of sovereign African nations that were often warred upon, invaded, and colonized. So you have to come with your sovereign self. You have to dig back into your own ancestral archives to be able to speak with the power and the authority of your people and your lineage, and to demand that you be heard. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that we have now come to the close, if there is no remarks from Olive. If I don't see any remarks from Olive here, then I will take this opportunity to thank you all for attending.
There is one hand there.
There was.
Oh, he has an African hand.
Who?
My own hand.
Look at his hand is an African hand here.
Well, Abaisha, there. Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Everybody, first of all, I want to tell everybody I will thank you for the good work you are doing. But I want to say hello to my brother, Lönn. You know, we went here in Amsterdam by the archives and the to do research.
Yes.
I'm happy to see you again, and I'm very happy to see Sister Esther again. She's very passionate, and it's always always something happens. You see you feel the ancestors speaking. But I have a question about what Sister Esther was talking about. I came late, sorry for that. But I was thinking, can we just copy the model of our the Jewish people? Because they are well respected, and when it is about reparations or this topic, they are very respected. So maybe it is something to think about, how come that their model is working and not our model.
Well, that's an interesting question to find an answer to. But perhaps some of us have answers to it, but we will not give those answers. Oh, I see there was another hand that came up from our friend Nana from, where do I see her? If you can unmute yourself. There you are. Ask to unmute. Nana, please.
Greetings, family. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful insight of knowledge and being here together with my elders, my brothers and sisters. I'm very honored, and being together as a family. I just wanted to say, is it Brother Abassa? I like your question very much, because you asked the question about, can't we adapt the model of the Jewish? And as Sister Stanford-Xosei said before, we are not united. You see, the Holocaust that was done to the Jewish in Germany and in Europe was just, let's say, a couple of years. Yeah. And the Holocaust that was done to the African motherland has been since 600 years ago. So if you look at the Holocaust that was done, the Mangamizi that was done, as Sister Stanford-Xosei said, the Mangamizi that was done to the African motherland itself, they dividing the children in the diaspora without adding the mother to it. And how can we actually stand and fight for reparation if we don't even acknowledge our motherland, and we don't acknowledge the suffering that our motherland is still suffering till today? They will be playing with us, the children in the diaspora, unless we stand firm and say that you have destroyed our mother and our mother home and all her properties that she needed to survive. We as children will be continue playing and acting, and they will be playing with us. And they are the children of those people who caused those Mangamizi. So if we don't unite and respect our own motherland, I don't know how we're going to ask for reparation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this comment, which I think is very, very important. And I just want to be fair to everyone. If there is anybody who has asked for the floor and has not been recognized, I think he or she should. Did you speak before? Yes, you did. You did.
So once, yes.
Yes, exactly. So, okay, thank you. So with that, it's my pleasure to thank you all, because it has really been very...
Did he not speak because he speak before? Is that your...
Yeah, no, but he did not want to speak more. Am I right?
No, I do. I wanted to react to the question.
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, it is the question about adopting the Jewish model. And there is this saying in Africa that the Jewish people are God's people. They are untouchable. I know I'm venturing into a dangerous area now, but what is important is what the Sister Dagati also talked about. They have the support, they have the unity, they have people that represent power for them, and we don't have that because we are not united. And until we unite, we can adopt any model we like, but it will not stand. This is what I want to say.
Okay, thank you. Now we have Aishira Cecilia. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I was busy doing it directly, but I didn't know we could have offered a second contribution. Thank you very much. To Ms. Biekman and Ms. Esther, thank you very much for your responses. Here in St. Martin, we have organized ourselves. Probably the only organization that has and actually came out against the Dutch apology, which we say without reparations, we do not want apology. We do not accept it at all. We signed it. We brought together a petition about over 1,000 signatures that came out, and we continue to raise awareness for reparatory justice and the independence of the colonies in the Netherlands. It's called the One As Exempt. So we do that. So I wanted to raise awareness for the fact that some of our voices, because we still live in a very, in a colony, some of our voices may not be as heard because these institutions often respond to the government institutions and take what the government say as being what the people say. These things may not coincide. So we will continue to do our work as much as we can. And I also wanted to say, while these efforts of putting us together in this kingdom structure, which One XXM does not necessarily agree to, because we are a pro-independence organization. Sometimes if something is being created in the Netherlands, for example, and we're not aware of it, then the question is, so how is it, who is being represented properly, and is the community involved with the distance and with not being connected necessarily? Again, even with this report that was done officially from the government, without organizations like One XXM talking to the people and telling them this is happening, let your voices be heard, we would have not been included. So we are fighting to be put on that. Well, I just want everyone to know that these things do exist. Sometimes the other Caribbean countries, because they are already far ahead in the independence movement and they're already independent, sometimes our voices are not necessarily heard. So I just wanted to share that. We will continue to pay attention to what is going on and join these talks as they are very informative. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. And I think we have now come to the conclusion of this very successful meeting, successful because we have such good panelists and we had such good participants who came together here. We have had more than 40 participants altogether. I did count. It's nearly 50. In fact, when we counted all that were present on some time here during the webinar. So I thank you all, and goodbye and good night. But we will continue to work together, especially the World Against Racism Network, which has been particularly engaged in this since the very beginning in the campaign against racism, since the time of the apartheid struggle, and now since the time when we were campaigning for the UN to have a world conference against racism in Durban, and after that the decade. And now I think we really must bring this message out and win new friends and work together and stand up against any form of disinformation on the issues. So I thank you so much, and the webinar is concluded. Thank you so much.